Welcome to episode 128 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time we're going to talk about George Benson's first album for Columbia in 1966 and his second album as leader overall, It's Uptown. And this is, of course, the first Canadian pressing of this album with the notation that he is the most exciting new guitarist on the jazz scene today. George Benson these days, of course, is known as the purveyor of smooth jazz for the 1970s and 1980s. Here in 1966, he's 23. He only did one album as a leader for Prestige prior to signing with Columbia, and this is the first of his two records for that label, along with the George Benson Cookbook. Neither of those albums made that much of an impression then, but they're quite well regarded now. For anybody who's a fan of George Benson's later work, this is not smooth jazz. This is George Benson in his earliest incarnation as a total speed merchant of the fretboard. On this album, he's in the process of inheriting Wes Montgomery's crown as the most technically gifted electric jazz guitarist. Interestingly, given how diverse his taste would be as he moved into the 1970s and 1980s, there's a real eclecticism to the song selection here as well. George Benson was born in Pittsburgh in 1943, and he turns out to be a musical prodigy as a child. He won a singing contest at age 4, he picked up the guitar relatively early on, and he was a big fan of jazz guitarist Charlie Christian. He was playing in clubs from the age of 8 when they weren't being closed down by the police. He became relatively well known as a teenage musical prodigy, and jazz club owners in Pittsburgh would let him come listen to the gigs, normally having him stationed right by the door to make a fast getaway in case the cops showed up. He made records as early as age 9 under the name Little Georgie. He did a couple of singles for RCA. These singles didn't chart, and eventually his guitar was taken away as part of a truancy investigation. How could you tell he was young, gifted, and black? Well, maybe by how the state treated him. In the late 50s, he had his own R&B band in Pittsburgh, but his real breakthrough comes in 1961. Jack McDuff, of course, is a well-known soul jazz organist, and he had a gig in Pittsburgh and needed a guitarist, so he advertised. Benson, who'd been listening to jazz players on the radio and copying their solos note for note, shows up, plays some solos, gets hired in the spot. And it's only after he's been hired into the group that McDuff realizes that Benson has copied all this stuff, but has no actual education in jazz and doesn't really understand the style beyond the music which he has learned by rote. And he almost gets punted because of this lack of musical education, but instead McDuff relents and basically takes him under his wing. And in that 2 or 3 year period, as Benson himself says, he basically got his jazz musical education. Part of McDuff's band, Benson appears on no fewer than 6 albums in 2 years. All the while he's progressing enormously, and in 1962, Prestige Records asked him to record his own album as a leader, and he's supported by Jack McDuff on that. Despite having his own album out, in 1964, Benson is still not that well known. One evening, he and his quartet are playing the Palm Tavern, which is on 125th in Harlem, and his manager, a guy called Jimmy Boyd, knew John Hammond, the famous A&R man from Columbia, the guy who had discovered both Aretha Franklin and Bob Dylan. Anyway, Boyd invites Hammond to come listen to the gig. And Hammond shows up. Not only is it George Benson, but he's got some great players in his quartet at the time. He's got Lonnie Smith on organ and Ronnie Cuber, the baritone saxophonist, as well in his quartet. Hammond thinks the gig is great, the quartet is good, loves Benson's playing, and on the strength of that, signs Benson to a 2-record deal with Columbia. And this album, It's Uptown, is the first of those 2 records. Hammond himself produces this recording session. The lineup, in addition to Benson, Smith, and Cuber, includes 3 other players. These include Benny Green on trombone and 2 drummers who split the tracks, Jimmy Lovelace and Ray Lucas. Benson made his early mark as a guitarist as a very fast technical player, and the arc of his career is about him slowing down and becoming more soulful in his technique. Here, he's very much still in his speed demon phase. Through this period, and again, he's only 23, he's busy absorbing lots of advice from some of the greatest players, people like Kenny Burrell, Wes Montgomery. And Montgomery in particular had urged him to slow down to be able to pick up the real beauty of the melody. He would, I think, in my opinion, end up becoming so melodically focused that he goes too far in the other direction, perhaps. But here he's just starting that journey, and he's very much about speed. It's also interesting to situate this album in the broader sweep of Benson's career. This is supposedly his sort of supreme jazz credibility era, where what he's playing would appeal to purists, and eventually, of course, he then begins to migrate and cross over into funkier and poppier sounds in the 1970s and 1980s. Yes, this is very much a jazz album, but it is full of all kinds of interest and the same kind of focus on eclecticism which would characterize him later on. So in some respects, although he's very much the speedy jazz guitarist here and not the smooth purveyor, you can very much hear the origins of the George Benson that he was going to become a decade later. There's some really straightforward bop and Hello Birdie and Minor Bird Blues and Willow Weep for Me. But you've also got some real rock influences, like in the song Jaguar and the Bo Diddley Beat that actually introduces the song Bullfight. Six of the 11 tracks in this album are Benson compositions, and the first of those is the first track on side one, Clockwise. I talked about being a speed demon. Well, this is a really rapid-fire song. The first turn is actually for Ronnie Cooper on baritone sax, but then Benson comes in and he is playing a million miles an hour. It's quite breathtaking, and he doesn't miss a note of a rapid, complex solo. It's almost a bit of a relief when Lonnie Smith comes in with what is a more soulful solo towards the latter part of the song. The next song is a cover of Gershwin's Summertime, that jazz standard. This is a fantastic rendition. This is a real highlight of this record. Ray Lucas is a drummer on this, and if anything, he gives it a bit of a rock and roll feel. The drums and the horns are basically playing in unison, which is kind of a more aggressive feel to the rhythm than you normally encounter in jazz. Benson sings here, and he's already polished at this age. This is a really great version and a great interpretation. Ain't That Peculiar is next. It's got this really great spooky guitar riff at the start, and then you have a very similar kind of a rock feel to the previous song, and you've got sax and guitar playing in unison. What stands out for me in the song, which is another real highlight, is the unity of the band, how tight the players were in this session. The strong songs in side one continue with Jaguar, which is a soul jazz tour de force. If you're wearing go-go boots, you're going to want to find a plinth to dance on, because this is just an infectious tune. Very Austin Powers, yeah baby! That's followed by a total change of mood with Willow Weep for Me. This is the longest song on side one. Some interesting little production choices, or maybe just quirks in the recording. George is playing a solo at one point, and Lonnie's organ is kind of just sort of dropping in, almost as if he's just warming up in the background. It's strange to me they didn't do a second take. After about 2 minutes of this song, the rhythm section breaks into the main groove. The star for me here is Lonnie Smith, who's got this incredible tone in his Hammond. It's almost like water pouring. It's a really just delicious liquid feeling to this tune. The whole feel is kind of loose and spontaneous. It's riveting. I can't think of many jazz tracks from this era that have as many different sound textures in one song, albeit spread out over 6 or so minutes, as this one. It's really quite a trip. The last song on side one is a Gershwin number, A Foggy Day, which is not the best vocal turn that George has ever done. It feels a bit of a throwaway, lounge singery kind of a piece. Side one started with a Benson original, and actually 4 of the 5 songs on side 2 are originals as well. The first of those is Hello Birdie, which kicks off the side. To my ears, this is a pretty standard bop piece with a very typical head arrangement, head, solos, and then head, and that's the end of the song. Supposedly, this has got a Latin feel according to the liner notes. I'm not actually hearing it. This is just straight up hard bop. The Bullfight, the next track, actually has a Bo Diddley beat to start. I don't think I've ever heard that on a jazz track. This is Latin jazz, and it sounds great, and Benson has pulled off a really authentic feeling Spanish arrangement. The next song is Stormy Weather. This is a competent performance and a competent vocal of a well-known standard. Not much to say about that, really. And then we're back to another Benson original, Eternally, and this is another song with a real Latin feel. It's got a beautiful, moody solo from Benson, and then an equally good but much bluesier solo on baritone by Kuber. The final track is also the last of the originals, and that's Minor Bird Blues. If you like fast guitar playing, this is a song for you. This solo in here by Benson is absolutely lit. In contrast, this song has kind of a peculiar solo outing by Lonnie Smith on organ, in which large sections of his playing are almost inaudible in the lower registers. It's almost like it was mic'd poorly or something. Anyway, it's a bit of an uneven ending to what is generally a pretty strong record. It's Uptown has some pretty strong performances from Benson and his bandmates, particularly on the originals. The standards in general are much less impressive, and I guess by definition less eclectic. There's lots of fiery guitar in here, there's some pretty cool arrangements, and there's a few little odd production quirks. The 3 vocal numbers as a group are just okay in my book. The best by far are the instrumentals and the instrumental originals in particular. It's a very enjoyable album. It's a very significant album in Benson's history, and intriguingly, it's a signpost to some of the steps he'd take in his future career. For me, it's a 4 out of 5.